Okay, guys, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My intention was to welcome you to African Wildlife Foundation, but it looks like I only have to welcome my colleague Jock from the Department of State and long-lost friend Emmy Widerman, kind of AWF anyway. Thanks everybody for being here. I think I'll quickly pass on to Rebecca, who leads our ABCG Secretariat, to give you a pitch on what ABCG is about, and then we will move on to the next step.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Rebecca Goodman. I coordinate the Africa Biodiversity Collaborative Group. We are a consortium. Good? Okay. Of these organizations, AWF, of course, Conservation International, the Jane Goodall Institute, the Nature Conservancy, the Wildlife Conservation Society, the World Wildlife Fund, and the World Resources Institute. And together, we're leveraging the resources of these organizations to tackle complex and changing conservation challenges facing the continent, and really pooling the best minds and knowledge to kind of bring together this array of expertise and apply towards these emerging and new threats to biodiversity conservation. And we do that by first prioritizing biodiversity conservation in international development agendas and human well-being, promoting good conservation practices amongst practitioners. That includes other international NGOs as well as local civil society, and then partnering with those organizations in Africa to build their capacity to implement those practices. We are currently in a 3-year grant phase. We're fully funded by USAID. It began in late 2015 and extends through this year. And so during that time, we're concentrating on these themes. The first is land and resource tenure rights, land use management for conservation planning, and then managing global change impacts on biodiversity is a bit ambiguous, but we're essentially taking a look at human responses to climate adaptation and how those are having a direct effect on biodiversity. And then global health linkages to biodiversity conservation, which is split into 2 sub-areas, being WASH, water, sanitation, hygiene, and PHE, population, health, and environment, and integrating biodiversity conservation into those sectors. We have a 5th area called emerging issues, which essentially employs a small grants mechanism. Those go to member organizations in partnership with local institutions. They're small, 1-year targeted projects that are really aimed to kind of jumpstart, either a pilot project or a major stakeholder workshop or something like that. That's about all I'll say. There's plenty more information on the website. We also have a social media presence, and I think the best way to find out about events like these and our publications and recent news is through the listserv. So if you're not already on it, I would encourage you to sign up. You can do that on our homepage, abcg.org. And then, of course, you're always welcome to contact me. I have a counterpart who's based in Nairobi. So if you're ever passing through, you can pop in and say hello. She's based at the Wildlife Conservation Society there. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it back to Jamil to introduce Kathleen, for those of you who don't know her. And then we'll hear from her about Uganda. Thanks.
Great, thanks Rebecca, and welcome again other colleagues. That's just got in here. You didn't miss much. She was just introducing African Biodiversity Collaborative Group. Now, Kathleen Fitzgerald, who is our speaker for this afternoon, is a vice president for our programs in East and Southern Africa. She has been with African Wildlife Foundation for close to 10 years or more. And what she does is really to provide the technical leadership on everything we do in East and Southern Africa at landscape level. Today, she's going to be talking about an issue that I know we all care about. How do we sustain financing of protected area in Africa? How do we fund conservation? I think a lot of us have been working hard, fundraising, we continue to do so, but I think it's a point where we need Africa and the parks themselves to contribute towards the financing of what happens to sustain the wildlife heritage in Africa. So Kathleen, please take us through the whole thing. The process is, if you need any clarification as you speak, please raise your hand. But I would want us to hold our questions to the end so that we can all just have a rich discussion at the end. So over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jamil. Good. Good afternoon, everyone. Actually, there are a lot of new faces because there's so many new AWF staff members. So thanks for coming. Those that I don't know, my name's Kathleen, as Jamil just said, and I'm based in AWF headquarters in Nairobi, Kenya. So I can use the excuse that I came in yesterday if I'm a little slow today. What I want to talk about, though, is conservation finance, which is an issue that's really important to Africa. It's very important to African Wildlife Foundation, and it's something that I'm extremely passionate about. So I want to talk with you, one, about, just briefly for those of you that don't know AWF, a little snapshot of who we are and what we do. Then I want to talk with you about the macro level issue about conservation finance in Africa. How big is this problem? And then I'll drill down into Uganda, where we have a really exciting initiative where we're working with the government of Uganda to really optimize the commercial opportunities in Uganda. So for starters, AWF, those of you that don't know, our mission is to ensure that wildlife and wildlands endure and thrive in modern Africa. And how we do this is through large landscape scale programs. So we work at large landscapes in sub-Saharan Africa. We really have 5 core programs that we implement. Conservation science, we're a science-based organization. We focus on a suite of focal species: elephants, rhinos, large carnivores, and great apes. Conservation Biology 101, if we protect enough habitat for those species, we will capture enough habitat for about 80% of Africa's biological diversity. Second program is habitat and land conservation, and that includes creating new protected areas. And what I mean by that is everything from national parks to community conservancies, as well as management. And I'll be talking about that. It's one thing to draw a line on a map and say it's a protected area. It's another thing to actually make it work. Third is enterprise. Again, this is what I'm going to be speaking about. How do we pay for this? How do we develop businesses that support and sustain conservation? It's one of our major program areas, and that's where protected area finance comes in. Our Classroom Africa program is an incentive mechanism for communities living with wildlife and adjacent to protected areas. And finally, policy and advocacy. We can have the best programs on the ground, but if we don't have a supportive environment, we won't succeed in what we do. So that's what we do. And lastly, where do we do this? So sub-Saharan Africa is huge. And the way that AWF prioritizes is based on a landscape scale conservation analysis that we do. We combine science with practical issues. And from that, we've come up with 41 priority landscapes. And in these landscapes, we implement, in some places, like Democratic Republic of Congo, holistic programs that include all 5 programs. In other areas, like in Namibia, we financed a lodge, or we support Save the Rhino Trust. So we're nimble and adaptive depending on what is needed in these landscapes. So these are the 41 places that we work. So I know that the cover slide said Uganda, but I want to take you to Zimbabwe. And this is a picture of a park called Matusadana National Park. And it's a famous park that's on the shores of Lake Kariba. And the reason I'm taking you here is the last time I was here, I saw no rangers in the field, and I was there for 3 days. And the reason we saw no rangers, number one, they have no vehicles. Number two, they haven't been paid in months. And so they're deflated and they're not going out on patrol. This is one of Zimbabwe's most important elephant parks. And yet the rangers aren't protecting it. Why? It comes down to finance. They don't have the capacity and they don't have the resources to manage Matusadana National Park. When I was in Matusadana, upriver is Manapools National Park. We heard on the radio that an elephant had been shot in Manapools. Manapools is a famous park in Zimbabwe. And as we're listening to the chatter on the radio, the guys couldn't respond to the elephant that had been poached because they don't have vehicles. They don't have radios. They haven't been paid. Downriver, so this is all in the Zambezi Valley in Zimbabwe, is another protected area called Chizoria. And Chizoria used to be a prime protected area in Zim. There's basically no wildlife left because of poaching. And now what they're looking at is potentially degazetting Chizoria because it's not providing benefit to the country. These are the issues that Africa is facing in terms of protected area finance. This is not about Zimbabwe, this is about Africa. A majority of our parks in Africa are underfunded and donor dependent, and this is the real challenge that we have. So how big is this challenge? There's been a lot of assessments done to try to figure out how much money do we really need for protected area management. And of course it varies. There's a really great study done by McKinsey Group, and they looked at all developing countries globally. And the figure they came up with was annually, we are short $1.7 billion for protected area management annually. So that's a huge figure that we know donor funding is not going to be able to accommodate. And it just gives you a sense of the scale of the challenge. So let's take it down even one more level. What does this mean for Africa? How do you translate 1.7 to Africa? Again, how much do you need to manage a protected area? It depends on your protected area. It depends on the size. It depends on the shape. It depends on your species. If you're managing a protected area that has rhinos, you're going to need 3 times the amount of money you do for a protected area that doesn't have rhinos. So it varies. How much do you need then to manage a park for lions? So a study was done by Craig Packer, and what he came up with is you're managing a park that has lions. You need $500 per square kilometer for a fenced protected area. So like Southern Africa, we have a lot of parks that are fenced. For unfenced, you need $2,000 US per kilometer square, right? So just as an example, Kruger National Park, most famous park in South Africa, robust tourism industry, has domestic as well as international tourism. They manage that park at about $1,800 US per kilometer square. Pretty good. On average, protected areas in Africa are managed at $50 US per square kilometer or less. So you can debate the numbers, but the bottom line, it's simply not enough money. Okay, so take that down even one more level. How does this budget translate to practical issues on the ground? Let's go back to vehicles. And this is actually what a lot of vehicles look like in protected areas in Africa. Panthera did an assessment. 187 parks with lions, they assessed vehicles. How many vehicles do you have? And what they found was 50% of those protected areas had 2 vehicles or less. And you can be sure if you have a vehicle that looks like that, one of them is generally in the shop, right? 15% had 0 vehicles. So again, think back to Manapools. If you have a poaching incident and you have no vehicle, you simply cannot respond. So again, this just emphasizes the issue around finance. Now, I'm not going to depress you too much. Here's the good news. The good news is we know that if you increase revenue for protected areas And if you use that money wisely in terms of management and allocation, conservation outcomes will go up. So this is a direct correlation between management budgets and lion density. Increase your management budget, use the money wisely, you'll see a direct increase in lion density. So that's the good news. And that's why AWF, our Protected Area Finance Program, is focused on working with governments to increase revenue for protected areas. Because we know if we can do that, we'll see a direct benefit in wildlife.
What are the red dots? I'm sorry. Did you say something with red and green?
So those, the red dots are different geographical areas. Again, this goes to the Panthera assessment. And I can share with you the paper on this. It's quite interesting. Okay, so let's go back to Zimbabwe again, just to give you 3 quick examples of this issue of protected area finance. 27% of Zimbabwe is protected area. And we know over the last decade, Zimbabwe has had some challenges with its economy. Their protected area management budget went from $200 per square kilometer in 1980 to now they're at $10 per square kilometer. Simply not enough. And ZimParks, the Protected Area Authority in Zimbabwe, is responsible for raising all of their revenue. They are not receiving any subsidy from the government. So it's a real challenge. Kruger National Park. They have a pretty robust budget. However, they're subsidized by the government of South Africa. So even a place like Kruger, with a really diverse tourism industry, is still being offset by the government. I think that's an important point because we often hear parks need to be self-sufficient. They need to be self-financed. It's just not realistic. And Kruger, because of the poaching crisis, for example, receives a lot of donor funding. Howard Buffett donated $25 million to Kruger for rhino conservation. So even Kruger, rely on donor funding. Last example, Democratic Republic of Congo, second largest country in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the Protected Area Authority there says they need $30 million annually to manage their protected area estate. We all know how important Congo is. It's the green lung of Africa. It has 400 mammalian species. It's one of the most ecologically rich countries in Africa. The government of DRC last year gave $900,000 for conservation. Donor funding pays for about 99.5% of protected area management. Now, we know donor funding is great. However, it's unpredictable, it's fickle, and it's unsustainable. And so again, that's why AWF is focusing on working with governments to help them increase their own revenue, because what we're finding is money is being left on the table. So our approach is threefold. Number one, working with governments to increase revenue. So how are we doing that? I'm not talking about adding more lodges or adding more beds. In some places, maybe that's the best model. But in a lot of places, what we're finding is just by tweaking your concession model, you can increase revenue. We've just done this in the Masai Mara in Kenya. So increase the revenue. Now, if revenue is not being allocated in the right place, you can have all the money in the world, but it's not going to achieve conservation. So I'm going to pick on Zimbabwe, but what we found is a lot of the revenue in Zim goes to headquarters. That's not going to help conservation performance. So one of the things we look at is where revenue is allocated. And then lastly, management performance. If you don't have good management, even if you have a lot of money and it's going in the right place, you're not going to have a conservation outcome. So those three things are critical in terms of protected area finance. So Uganda, let's go to Uganda. Many of you have been to Uganda, many of you know Uganda. It's an incredible country, one of the 10 most biologically diverse in the world. So incredibly significant. And this map shows you protected areas. 16% of Uganda is protected area. And you see really two clusters, one along this east side here, and then the other here along the rift. AWF has had a long history of working in Uganda. It's called the Pearl of Africa, again, because of its ecological significance. It hosts more than 50% of the mountain gorilla population. I think you get the point. It's pretty important biologically. Now, Uganda's protected areas, at one time, they were the prime in tourism. They were one of the top. And over the last 2 decades, things kind of went down a little bit. And other countries like Kenya and Tanzania, Botswana, and other places really resumed leadership in the market. That said, Uganda's protected areas today support about 1 million jobs and contribute significantly to the GDP. And what we're trying to do now is increase that. How do we increase more revenue from the protected areas and contribute more to the government? USAID funded a study and they looked at the financial gap. Every year there's a $15 million financial gap. So that means the Ugandan Wildlife Authority and the National Forestry Authority, the 2 main entities managing protected areas in Uganda, have a major gap. And donors are giving about $15 to $20 million a year in finance. What's happening now, though, in Uganda is really exciting. It's starting to be recognized once again as one of the best destinations for tourism. And here's a whole list. Lonely Planet said it's a top destination. National Geographic said Rwenzori Mountains are a must-see. You must go hiking there. So again, we're starting to see a bit of a buzz about Uganda. And tourism between 2012 and 2016 went up about 35%. That's pretty good. So those of you that have visited Uganda, you know it has a world-class product. There's no other place in the world where you can go, literally, in the morning, you can be in a savanna in Murchison Falls with elephants and lions. In the afternoon, you can go to Budongo Forest, 3-hour drive, and be with chimpanzees. And then the next morning, go to Bwindi, and you're with mountain gorillas. There's no other place in Africa or in the world where you can do that. So they have one of the best tourism products. However, their infrastructure is not so great. And that's one of the things that we're looking at. The other thing is the investment environment is quite challenging. And I'll talk a little bit about that. If you're a tourism operator and you want to develop in Uganda, it's quite challenging. And so that's been one of the barriers for investment. The other interesting thing, if you look at revenue for Ugandan Wildlife Authority, this is from 2015. And this is something we see in a lot of African countries. So most of Africa's protected area authorities share revenue between parks. So in Tanzania, for example, Serengeti and Mount Kilimanjaro generate a majority of the budget for all the protected areas. So they share the revenue. And it's the same thing in Uganda. A majority of their funding comes from gorilla trekking and chimpanzees. But gorillas is about 58%. Now that's okay, because it's a good revenue earner, right? But what happens if the population gets wiped out? Not only do you lose an important species, but your entire protected area system could collapse because of that one species. So one of the things that we're trying to do is help diversify the tourism portfolio so that they're not overly reliant on one park or one species, which they are right now. So that's where the Ugandan Giants Club Conservation and Tourism Investment Forum, it's a long name, came into play. So the Giants Club is a project of Space for Giants. And Space for Giants is an organization that AWF partners with in Kenya. They're an organization based in Kenya. And the Giants Club is essentially a club of African presidents who have committed to conservation. And a couple years ago, they had a summit in Kenya focused on elephants. And the president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, was in Kenya. And when he left that meeting, he asked Space for Giants to help them, the country of Uganda, optimize the economic opportunities in their parks. He basically said, we need to make more money from our parks. Can you help us do that? And so Space for Giants contacted AWF, and together we've been working since April of 2017, last year, to do that. And one of the amazing things about this project is the partnership, the power of partnership. This initiative is being driven by the government of Uganda. It's included the divisions which you need if you're going to do tourism, the Ugandan Investment Authority, the Ugandan Tourism Bureau. UNDP has helped to fund it. Obviously, the two protected area authorities, UA and NFA, are core to this project. And this is the structure. So again, this is coming from the top. This is being directed by the president of Uganda. Directly underneath is the Minister of Tourism, Wildlife, and Antiquities. So he is chairing this tourism and conservation initiative. Underneath the minister, you have a steering committee. Now, oftentimes you hear of these committees, they don't really, are they active? This is a really active committee, meets monthly, they're driving this process. And again, it includes the wildlife authorities, the ministry, the office of the president, the investment bureau, the tourism bureau, etc. And then at the bottom are the people that do all the work, and that's us. It's the African Wildlife Foundation, Space for Giants, and our partner, Conservation Capital. So what are we actually doing? Well, when we started the work in April 2017, we had 5 main tasks. One was to assess the conservation status of protected areas in Uganda. And really what we were looking at is what are the areas that are most threatened? What are the areas that are most ecologically significant? We had a consultant paid by UNDP to do that work. Again, the whole purpose is designing tourism to mitigate conservation threats. So we had to start with what are the important areas and where are the threats. Next was identify priority investment opportunities in protected areas. And those opportunities need to be commercially viable and they need to result in conservation. So this meant running around all the different parks, looking at where are there tourism opportunities and where can we achieve conservation outcomes. So the team included tourism experts and conservationists. Third thing we had to do is by 6 October, so that was just 6 months after we were given this task, we needed to be ready to present investment-ready opportunities to a forum of global tourism investors. Next thing was an enabling framework. So that goes back to my comment about Uganda being difficult to invest in. One of the first things we did was we contacted tourism investors in Uganda and outside of Uganda. And the number one thing they said was, it's a pain in the neck to invest in Uganda. I'm obviously summarizing. But the point was, if you're a tourism investor and you were going into Uganda, you had to go to 10 different ministries, 10 different departments. Everyone wanted something different. And most operators said, until they sort that out, we're not coming into Uganda. The amazing thing was the Ugandan Investment Authority, the Uganda Tourism Bureau, by October 6th at that forum, announced a one-stop shop investment department. They fixed it. So now if you're going to invest in Uganda, you go to that one place and they will service your needs. It has changed everything. Lastly, engaging potential investors. So throughout this process, we had to engage top investors, Wilderness, Singida, and beyond, the top investors, as well as all the Ugandan tourism investors. And so this has been a long process of bringing these investors on board. We looked at 3 different things. So your core area is here, your national park. And originally what the president said was, I want you to focus on these tier 2 areas, which are basically your reserves that are adjacent to your protected areas. Because those are the places that really lack the capacity for management. And then the tier 3 are your community areas and forest areas. What we found was, in order to get some of the top investors into Uganda, they wanted to invest in some of the core areas in addition to the tier 2 areas. So you'll see when I share what we actually presented to the forum, it was a blending of all 3. And then in terms of the type of investment, we looked at 3 things: co-management, tourism investment, and then other enterprises. Other enterprises we just started to look at. That wasn't part of the first phase. It's something that we're looking at now. So the 2 key areas is co-management as well as tourism. And this just gives you a sense of how we organized our thinking. So when I showed you the map of Uganda, there are clusters of protected areas. Again, along the Rift Valley and then in the eastern part of the country. So we looked at each of those clusters. We looked at what opportunities are there. Is a conservation assessment? Has it been done? Does one need to be done? And this is how we organized our approach. Just a quick comment on co-management. When we were originally assigned this work, co-management was not part of what we were tasked to do. But what we quickly realized is that no tourism investor is going to invest $5 million in a tourism lodge or a tented camp if the protected area is not well managed. There's no way. So what we recognized was, and many countries in Africa are now doing co-management agreements. We recognize that some of these places, the reserves, the nature reserves, the forest reserves, we need to also bring in co-management opportunities. And so this was a process because obviously co-management is done with the government. So it involved a whole new piece of work, essentially presenting to the Board of Uganda Wildlife Authority, the Ministry of Wildlife and Tourism, as well as the Board of National Forestry Authority co-management. And just a quick snapshot on co-management. What we're finding, again, think about that big financial gap. A lot of governments are inviting co-management opportunities in their protected areas. So AWF, for example, we co-manage parks in Ethiopia, Cameroon, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Tanzania. Many donors are now requiring co-management agreements. They don't want to keep investing in protected areas if there isn't a partnership agreement. German Development Bank is one example. So part of the work that we did was presented to the Ugandan government on co-management. And we shared with them what it actually means, because the word co-management is thrown around, and it means very different things. So if you go on the left, support to protected areas. That's something AWF has done for a long time. We provide management plans, we provide equipment, we provide training, but we don't have a contract, we don't have a legal agreement. We could walk away tomorrow. So it's little risk for us, but it's also little accountability. And as you move to the right, you can go all the way to a fully delegated management agreement. So you've heard of African parks. They do fully delegated management, where essentially the park is handed over to them for management. I'm oversimplifying, but that's essentially what it means. It means an increased risk by that partner, but it also means more clarity, right? You know who's in charge, who's making decisions, etc. So we presented this to the government of Uganda, presented the options, walked them through what this means, and both the Ugandan Wildlife Authority and NFA approved this as a model. So this too became something we presented at the forum. So here's the forum. We did all this work leading up to the forum, which was held in Kampala. And here you have the president himself, who was at the forum. He was the keynote speaker. Executive director of UNEP, Eric Stolam, Minister of Environment, UNDP, Russian investor who owns a number of newspapers in the UK. We had about 150 people in Kampala for one day. It included potential investors. It included global operators, some of the top operators from all over Africa. And at the forum, we presented the investment opportunities. We had a series of sessions from existing operators. Here is AWF President Kadu Segunya, who was on a panel with new operators and existing operators in Uganda. And as I mentioned, the president himself gave one of the keynote speeches. Basically what happened at this event was the president announced that Uganda is open for smart, sustainable conservation investment. The other thing that happened is the one-stop shop was announced, so investors were quite impressed. Each of the institutions, like the Tourism Bureau, Ugandan Wildlife Authority, also announced smart incentives. So essentially, investors walked away extremely impressed. I had one investor say to me they've invested $100 million in Tanzania, and they've never seen the level of commitment from government that they saw in Uganda, which is pretty impressive. Again, the fact that this was driven by the government was quite impressive. So at the forum, two types of investments were unveiled. And I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but the first were tourism concessions. And my colleague, Alistair Pohl, was the one presenting these options. These were the 5 areas that we highlighted for tourism investment. We didn't get to specific site level, but what we did was we described each place, we talked about the opportunity, and we talked about the infrastructure, access, etc. So you'll note most of it is in the west. And those Ugandans from the east, they didn't like that. But what we had to continue to tell them was investment-ready opportunities. These were areas where there are opportunities right now for investment. So this area here, many of you probably know Penupe in the eastern part of the country, incredible, but it's just not ready for investment. There are already legal agreements and issues. We could not unveil that as an opportunity. So for each of the sites, we shared a map, we shared what is special, got people excited. This is Murchison Falls. Any of you have been there, you've seen this, it's amazing. And then we described the place. So we talked about size, the landscape, the habitat, what wildlife they'll see there, practical things like how do you get there? If you're going to invest there, how do you get there? How's the access? What's the existing tourism? How many lodges are there? How many tourists already go there? So for each of the sites, we ran through these. In some areas, we got into specifics. So for example, in the heart of Murchison, which is in the central part of Murchison, as you can see, open grassland, elephant, lion, Rothschild giraffe, really special. We talked about the kind of opportunity available. So what we envisioned. So high-end tented camps, great for walking, a linkage to a forest that's in the park. So we really painted a picture of the opportunity. And we did the same for all of those clusters that I showed you on the map. So Chibali is another area which everyone got excited about. It's basically the primate capital of Uganda. And so the investors in the room are thinking about circuits, right? They're not going to fly in to just Murchison. They were all thinking about how to piece together a circuit. So Chibali became one of the top areas of interest because of the primates. And Kidepo in the north. And those of you from AWF, you know these names because these are places where we've been working for quite some time. Kidepo is a really special park right in the north of Uganda on the border of South Sudan. The biggest barrier for investment in Kidepo has been access. Many of you have been there. It's a pain in the neck to get there. The road's improving though, so from Murchison to Kidepo now it's 5 hours, and also there's air options. So these are the tourism investment opportunities we unveiled. And then the second category were public-private partnerships, co-management opportunities. So in the room was African Parks, Wildlife Conservation Society, other organizations who might be interested in co-managing some of these protected areas. And these are the 5 areas that we unveiled for co-management. So these are areas that UA and the National Forestry Authority are keen to have co-management agreements. So you've got the forest reserves, Budongo and Kalinzu, and then you have wildlife reserves in the eastern part of the country. So these sites were unveiled, people got excited, incentives were given, and then the day ended with a dinner hosted by the president at State House, and this was the group after dinner. And then we arranged one-on-one visits at 10 p.m. With the president himself. So again, these investors left thinking, wow, they're really serious about this, which was great. So what has happened since then? After the forum we've had now, it's been 5 months, and all the investors who came have been doing assessments in the field, which is pretty impressive. So we've had about 6, probably 1 to 2 week visits by potential investors to each of these sites. They've been coordinated with the government. They've been traveling with Uganda Wildlife Authority, our team in terms of tourism investor conservation practitioners. Public tendering is going to go out on May 15th, so that's about 10 days from now. That, of course, will be under Uganda Wildlife Authority because they are the stewards of the protected areas. We continue to provide technical support so that, for example, when you see this tender, it's going to look a little different because we're not looking for just investment. We're looking for conservation investment. We want to get investors, tourism investors, who are committed to conservation, have a track record for doing conservation. And the way we're designing it is so that UA has the criteria so that they can get the best operators. We're in the process of placing a full-time tourism advisor in Uganda Wildlife Authority. They have a great team, but what we're embarking on is a serious piece of work, and they need the support from a tourism expert within Uganda Wildlife Authority. The other thing that's happening is we're updating the tourism plans. So any investor that's coming in, their number one question is, if I'm going to develop a lodge here, how do I know someone's not going to come right next door? And the best way of ensuring that are good tourism plans with zoning, bylaws, regulations. So we're in the process of updating all of those plans. It's quite a bit of work. We're still identifying other sites. The tender that's going out in 10 days is only 3 sites. You can't flood the market with all of these sites, so we're just doing 3. And we're in the process of identifying other areas. And lastly, the legislation in Uganda for co-management requires that before co-management goes to market, you have to do a feasibility study, and that has to be done by an independent third party. So we're in the process of doing, it's basically a cost-benefit analysis to demonstrate to the government why co-management is necessary. So that's the work that's underway right now. And again, we're continuing to work with all of these partners in this process. The committees that I highlighted, technical committee, steering committee, continue. And this is an ongoing program that AWF is really proud to be a part of. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Kathleen. I believe we have folks online. And I want now to open the floor for questions in the room. And as anybody raises up their hand online, please let us know and they can ask questions. Maybe we do 3 questions in a row, and then we can be efficient. Who wants to go first?
What 3 sites are being tendered?
Murchison Falls, Shubali, and Queen Elizabeth. Sorry, not Queen Elizabeth, Kidepo. Murchison, Shubali, Kidepo. And as I said, we're when the tender comes out, we're not specifying exact locations. We want to leave it somewhat open so that the tourism investors have the flexibility of providing options. Obviously, internally, we know which sites are most appropriate for investment.
I have a question regarding the sites in the west of the country. I pulled up a map to look at the oil and gas overlay of those areas. I was curious how that factored into your conversations.
So it's obviously like Murchison, right, is a good example. It has to be part of the planning. And there are exciting discussions about offsets right now in Uganda. But in terms of actual investment, it's something all the investors are looking at. Number one, from an impact standpoint, what impact is it going to have on the wildlife? If you're going to be investing and tourism is going to be impacted by that kind of infrastructure, you've got to fully understand it. So it's been part of every discussion with every investor.
How about for the government too? Because it sounds like in this case, well done in terms of getting the highest level of endorsement for this. And so I'm curious too in terms of what sort of information or sense you get from the government in terms of their planning. Because as you're having all these conversations around tourism investment, are they also, inevitably there are also conversations going on around oil and gas and how does that? Any ideas?
There's like a wall
in
between separate discussions, even though they're interlinked. It is viewed separately, and I can't say that there is that same level of ownership and commitment. Yeah. Yes.
My question goes around the income generation. If you have the distribution going all to one pot and then going out to all the parks, what's my incentive to invest in one particular park when I'm seeing the money go away? So is this reference to entrance fees, or how is that going to be managed so that the investor actually feels comfortable that the resource that they're investing in will be there in the future?
So yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, revenue retention at park level is something that some parks do and other parks don't. One of the things we're exploring with the government, which I think is a really interesting idea, is so Murchison Falls, for example, it's well managed. It's a pretty safe investment besides the oil exploration in the west. There are other parks that are less well managed. And so one of the things that we were exploring is given certain breaks or fees in the first couple of years, if you have an investor that's going to go into an area that's not as well managed. So trying to figure out creative incentives to get tourism operators to go into those less developed, well-managed areas. And the government is keen on that. Revenue retention is something we're continuing to explore. And again, you've got to look at the macro level issue to look at how much does UA need to operate across the protected area system. And so this means just macro level business planning with UA, and that's what the tourism advisor is going to be doing because it's a key issue. And then the co-management, again, for some of those reserves like Jambura and other areas, there was no way any investor was going to go in without a partner who's going to bring the resources for management. And as part of those co-management agreements, revenue retention will definitely be one of the key things on the table in negotiations.
Do we have someone online?
A couple questions here.
Down
You can
here,
read them.
does
Where does it? Okay.
hunting.
The option of sport hunting.
What is it?
Could you
Sorry.
Read
So the
out.
question was, is the forum just on wildlife viewing, or does it also include sport hunting? Given the areas that we were looking at, we only looked at photographic tourism. An area like Penupe in the east, which I mentioned, will be a blending, it already is a blending of photographic tourism and sport hunting. But as I said, that's an area that already has existing contracts and investors, so we didn't focus on that area. But of all the sites we were looking at, none of them are sport hunting multiple use areas.
There's no other question.
That Emmanuel is not asking?
No, there's no other question. That was it.
Okay. That was Tim Rich.
Emmanuel said he wanted to ask a question, but he's not asking the question.
Maybe it has been answered.
Okay.
Oh, they're muted. I would like to learn
Anyone
about,
in the room in the meantime?
So what's the question?
The smart incentives.
I'd like to learn more about the smart incentives mentioned. I think that might be referring to some of the incentives for going into the more remote places. Some of the things that we're envisioning is maybe a reduction in concession fees in your first couple of years. That was one mechanism that we're exploring with UA in terms of incentivizing going into these less developed protected areas.
Keep them muted.
Yeah.
Any other questions in the room? Good to go? Go ahead, please.
It's not a question, it's a
Comment.
comment. Heidi Khalid here from the Global Environment Facility. Thank you for the presentation, very clear. I think I'm getting my mind organized as to the steps that need to be taking place to make this happen. I mean, the Global Environment Facility will start the seventh cycle of funding in July after the Jeff Assembly in Vietnam. Kyle, the president, is going to be part of the roundtable on wildlife. That roundtable is divided in two. It's basically anti-poaching and illegal wildlife trade. And the second part is on exactly wildlife-based tourism. And I think it's the first time that the JEF opens up a window, if you wish, for countries to show the allocation of financial resources for wildlife-based tourism.
Right.
So, and the question is, kind of, would countries decide to use some of the JEF resources to do some of the work that you have to have done? It looks like, from what I hear, two key ingredients. I mean, the president needs to be on board. Somebody really from the top needs to be leading the effort. I wonder how much of this would have happened if the president was not behind the whole idea. Perhaps he would actually go forward, but with less strength. How much was the assessment that you described here for the entire country? What was the initial cost? Because that looks like an easy step one, if you wish, if you are kind of wanting sort of to do it things from the bottom up. how much was the investment?
So
Roughly.
we did all this on a shoestring budget. It was super efficient. I mean, set aside the forum itself and the event, $150,000. So Uganda, so the conservation assessment, Uganda has a lot of great data. We didn't want to recreate what had already been done. However, it was really important to have a third party, and that's why we had a consultant under UNDP do the work. Because if we're designing investment opportunities, we needed a third party to really verify that we were looking at the right areas and looking at the right conservation targets. So that happened simultaneously under UNDP. Yeah.
Yeah, that could easily be one component of a larger wildlife-based tourism project in JEF7. The other entry point is on biodiversity strategy for the financial sustainability of the protected area system.
Right.
So it's actually a specific entry point for countries that would like to look at or take some actions to make the system sustainable. So I don't know, just there are very explicit opportunities in the JEF7 programming directions document. I mean, for countries to sort of invest if they wish. So happy to provide additional information on that one.
That's great.
So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, having the government ownership of this was critical because, as I said, we could have gotten people excited. We could have identified great places. But again, every investor we spoke with in the beginning said until the investment climate has changed, also midway through the process, or actually more recently, they've appointed a new director of Uganda Wildlife Authority, who is our former director. The hiring of Sam Wanda is another amazing sign because Sam is a conservationist. He's not a politician. And what that says to everyone in Uganda is they actually want someone who's going to run their parks well and not play politics. So that was another great sign about what's happening in Uganda. They've also just appointed a new director of the National Forestry Authority. I don't know if it's official yet, but it's a similar kind of person. So we're optimistic. We're seeing a bit of a shift in Uganda in terms of going away from the old way they were doing business, which is sending the right signal to tourism investors.
Can I maybe ask, because this could be related to your thinking through this, was NEMA involved in this as well?
No.
Because I think they're the GDF focal point.
Interesting. They were not.
Yeah, I mean, for those that don't know the JEF that well, the JEF Secretariat here in Washington deals with basically two people in the country, in the 144 countries that are eligible for funding. One is called the JEF Political Focal Point that deals with corporate matters between governments and the JEF. And the other one is the Operational Focal Point. It's an actual individual that sits in an office that was designed to deal with the JEF on top of another myriad of things that this person has to do. But that person is central because he or she is the one that, in the end, physically endorse the allocation of funding for particular projects. Without he or she on board, simply things won't happen. This individual is either taking decisions on his own, which is getting rare and rare, or is going to convene in a committee for taking decisions. There are various modalities as to how these operational focal points work, but they're absolutely central, I came from a conference call with Lesotho. They're interested, and they had the operational focal point on the line, who I happen to know. But that was a very, very clear signal that the ones that organized the call understood that without this person, they're going to go nowhere.
Right.
So, if you want to sort of push this agenda forward in the countries where you work, and others here in the room. I mean, somebody from the government, and in particular the operational focal point, needs to be aware of it.
Right.
Because you don't want to sort of put it on top of him at the very last minute. You want to bring him on board as early as possible.
We've gone a few minutes over, but there's just a couple more questions online, so maybe we'll wrap up with those. So there's one from Kristen. Let's do that one first, and then there's 4 from Jean-Marc, so maybe we can combine.
So Kristen has a similar question to what Amy was asking in terms of, you just changed. So what's the thinking on time frame for investment opportunities and other sites, and indeed for the whole vision? So time frame, I mean, for this tender that's about to go out, it'll be a 9-month process because the first thing that happens is expression of interest is submitted. The framework is mandated by policy in Uganda. That'll be reviewed, and then investors will have an opportunity for submitting a full proposal if they're invited. We are already looking at other sites. What it really comes down to is just sequencing the tenders, because you just can't throw them all out at the market at once. So it's going to be a phased approach, and it's ongoing. We're committing to another 2 years of working as part of this process.
Sorry, can I do the thing?
So this is a question about the Conservation Trust Fund. Here's what I know about the trust fund. The trust fund has been set up. This is a conservation trust fund that WCS has set up. USAID supported the establishment of the trust fund. The original vision was that biodiversity offsets from infrastructure within the Albertine Rift was going to go into the trust fund and then support conservation. My understanding, and I could be wrong, is that there's still, I know that a business plan was just done for the trust fund, and I do not believe they have any funding as of now to support conservation. So I think they're still developing the Ugandan Conservation Trust Fund. They do have a board, an independent board overseeing it. Yeah, how is the government going to address infrastructure gaps? Again, in terms of gaps, I think they're talking about just in terms of road and other infrastructure required to do tourism. That was one of the things that UA pledged, is a commitment to helping with infrastructure. They have the equipment. So Uganda Wildlife Authority certainly has committed to helping with access with roads. NFA, the National Forestry Authority, they're a bit further behind. And again, that's where if a tourism investor wants to go into an area that doesn't have good infrastructure, if they pledge to help with that infrastructure, that's kind of the offsetting of costs that we're looking at in order to incentivize their investment.
Great, I think we'll leave it at that for now. This webinar recording will be posted to abcg.org. Give us about a week to get it up, along with Kathleen's slides. So those resources will be available. And thanks for coming.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah.